welcome back to Living History with Ted Goldsboro and our guest Patrick McCabe, whose family owned the Rock Hill Quarry. And we're talking about stone and family and whatever, the machinery that was used in the quarry. And Pat, you have before you a picture of some workmen around stone. Could you tell me about that?
Sure. When I saw this picture, it took me back, a little tear in my eye with this one. These men are working with sledgehammers, picks, and hammers and wedges and tongs on a pile of rock, where they are making little ones out of big ones by hand. I saw the blow up of these, and I was able to identify. I know those men by name. I worked with them when I was a college freshman or sophomore. I worked a half a day in the stone quarry breaking stone, and half a day going to school. That experience pushed me to get the college education and never have to go back and work this hard for a living. But to identify the men in this picture, the gentleman positioning the stone with the rock with a pick is Bradshaw Funderburk. The man on the top with a sledgehammer in his hand is Joe Wyatt. Both African Americans, both lived in West Philadelphia. The gentleman on the far left is, I believe his name is Inocencio Martinez, one of the forerunners of the Puerto Rican migration of workers that came to the quarry. That's an interesting kind of point where in my lifetime I remember Irishmen, Italian extraction, African Americans, and Puerto Ricans working there side by side. One ethnic group would leave and another one would take their place as the workforce became more dispersed. But this operation, what they did, they broke the stone from the size you see here, which that stone that they're working on is probably a ton and a half, maybe a ton and a quarter. And they break it into pieces that were manageable to pick up. One man could pick up 50 to 80 pounds or so. And they would differentiate and place the stone in one pile or another, depending on whether it was face stone, which was for the exterior of a wall, or rough stone, which would be used as backup. And over to the far right-hand corner, there's a metal, half of the old crusher. The old crusher I mentioned earlier, there, the iron, what do you want to call that?
Bins? Sorting?
They were round tubes that the steam ran through. They
boiler
cut the boiler
kind
content. They cut those in half and made them into what they called skip boxes, which you put a chain on, picked it up, and it was the device that picked up the stone from the quarry floor and dumped it into a truck. That was part of the operation, and the steam shovel did that.
Wow.
Yeah. So this was probably back in the 1960s.
Yeah, 62, I believe it was. I have a coincidence there. I grew up in Narberth, and I was getting my master's at Penn, and I don't know what prompted me. I had my camera in the car. I was coming back from Penn a particular day, and for some reason, I think it was a Saturday, and I just went into your quarry without permission, and I took these pictures with a 35mm camera, and they were slides.
You weren't a fledgling student in geology, were you?
No. Interesting you mentioned that. I failed chemistry, and I had to change my master, my topic, my major, over to English.
Okay.
So I was a geology major.
You were a fledgling geologist. Yeah. Well, I knew enough that, and I think I've told you in the past that my knowledge of geology goes to 2 or 3 terms, and that's it. You know,
now, speaking of that, what kind of stone did you tell me this was?
It's called mica schist, S-C-H-I-S-T, which is part of geologically what they call in this area the Wissahickon Fault, which runs from the area we're in, I think, the lower end, all the way up into the Chestnut Hill area. And the stone is similar, yet it's different from area to area. And I mentioned that earlier about how different it is just on Rock Hill Road. There can be soft, hard, blue, gray, rusty brown, and the same thing is true of all of the Wissahickon Fault.
How did these, well, there were 2 questions. When McCabe brothers, your parents' generation, had the quarry, about how many employees were there?
Well, it varied, of course, depending on what was going on in the business world. But I would say from my earliest days as a water boy in the 40s up through the next 10, 15 years, they would employ anywhere from 20 to 40 men doing this kind of work, as this picture shows, working 8, 9 hours a day, 6 days a week. Some of the older ones who were really qualified would take Saturday afternoon off. They'd only work a half a day on Saturday, and that was like they were a big deal. Those guys, that they were allowed to do that. That was a prestige thing. The boss wouldn't fire them because they were, you know, shirking their duties or anything.
How was the pay based? Was it on seniority?
Oh no, it was on
the job,
your production.
It
was on your production. There wasn't any seniority. There wasn't a union operation.
Did we weigh how much they got done, or?
I suppose the supervisors, my dad and his brothers, from time to time, they knew what men were doing. They were observant. That was just what they were
watching.
What they were watching them, and the pay range, I think. Well, one of my part-time jobs in the summertime as a young kid, maybe 13 years old, 14 years old, was helping out the office staff, which consisted of, from time to time, 3 female cousins ran the office. Now, they weren't all there at the same time, but they would ask me to do the payroll. So I got to the point where I knew how many hours a week the men worked. I knew the hourly rate, and I would make up the payroll, and eventually go to the bank and get the money. Back in those days,
they were paid in cash.
They were paid in cash.
Wow.
In an envelope.
Wow.
At 4:30 on Friday afternoon.
Wow.
And not before.
Wow. Were there any time cards? Or you just knew when they came in?
My dad or uncles kept time in a time book.
Okay.
In a time book. There were no time cards.
You didn't push a meter or anything?
No. Everybody knew who was there. And I remember at one point talking about the men that worked in the quarry, and this is probably something typical of many manufacturing jobs of the era in the 40s. There would be a lineup outside of men coming in the morning, hoping to get a job for the day.
I was going to ask you where you got your employees.
And, well, there were certain ones who were permanent employees, but if the word got around that there was a need for extra help at McCabe's quarry, you might have 10 or 15 men show up and stand in line, and either my dad or my uncle, mostly my uncles, would come out and just say, you, and you. That's all we need for today. Come back later.
Wow.
And it was just accepted. It wasn't. It was just a way of doing business.
Now, Pat, when these men were thinking about OSHA and today's standards,
sure.
When these men were working, did they have like a leather apron or something? I mean, did the stone fly around? Could it go into their eyes?
This was 1940.
I know the answer.
This was not, the protection that this gentleman on the top, Joe Wyatt, he had this heavy cloth apron that he wore like as a bib, so it wouldn't wear out his pants. That was essentially why that was like that. But other than that, no. You just learned which way to stand when the chips were flying. As far as eye protection, you could tell from the way the gentleman was holding the wedge that the chips were going to fly this direction or that direction, and you stood elsewhere.
Wow. Knowing your trade.
Knowing your trade. Yeah. And I was taught that. That was part of the things that I was taught how to, by these men.
Now, if there were an accident, did you have anybody there, like a doctor or a nurse or anything, or what would you do if somebody got hurt on the job?
I think there was a first aid kit in the office.
Okay, the secretary would help.
The secretary would help, but I don't recall many horrific accidents in the stone quarrying business. No, no. Bear in mind,
we're going to have to take a break here pretty soon.
Okay.
But how did this big chunk happen to be there? Tell me about the dynamite.
Well, okay. There were a series of steps that to get the rock out of the quarry face. One was the use of dynamite, drilling holes in the rock, and then blasting away a certain section.
Pat, we've got to take an end here, but I really appreciated your being with us today, and we'll come back for another show, I hope.
Thanks much, Ted.
Thank you. You've been listening to Patrick McCabe, and I'm Ted Goldsboro, wrapping up this program on Living History.